groups like the Hyksos and the later Assyrians in the West did corrupt the original monotheism. As a matter of fact, at the time of Christ, there had been a revival of the earlier Helios cult, which began just after the conquest of Alexander the Great and continued through the intertestamental period, finally disappearing with the acceptance of Jesus as its fulfillment. That prophetic tradition of the Helios cult, or the Messianic movement within Judaism, was related to the expectation of the Kalki avatar in the Eastern Vaishnava context. The problem with the expectation of Kalki avatar in the West was that for centuries, the Mediterranean region had been plagued by false Basudeos or Vasudevs, sacred kings. These false sacred kings would dye their skin, have the palms of their hands and feet tattooed and their bodies tattooed with various auspicious marks, shave their faces and grow their hair long, wear golden dhotis, ride white horses, and do everything else that they could to pass themselves off as Vasudev or Krishna in his regal form. In fact, the problem was so prevalent that Greece and Rome passed laws forbidding the impersonation of Zeus or Jupiter. Some of these laws may be related to the present taboo on blackberries in some European villages. Scholars have speculated about the origin of this. Some have suggested that it's because the blackberry is sacred to the God of the Old Testament due to Jewish lore that it was a blackberry bush in which God appeared to Moses on the Mount Sinai. It's interesting to note that this blackberry in Asia is called Krishnaberry, and that I have personally seen plays, passion plays, in Asia where the person representing Krishna had used the juice of the blackberry to dye his skin. It's possible that it was blackberry juice that was used to dye the skin of the so-called sacred kings in the Western world. This may also account for the mystery of why the discus went out of use as a weapon in the Greek world, and it was only retained in the sport that we now know as an Olympian sport. In early days, of course, it was the exclusive weapon of the sacred or Vasudeo king. In the area of fable literature, scholars who have studied fables know that there's a close relationship between Indian fables, Greek, and Jewish fables. In fact, they have noted that the Indian version is more often closer to the Jewish version than that of the Greek. If one understands the source of the Indian lore, then they also can understand the relationship of the Jataka tales and Buddhist lore to the Indian lore. The Jewish fables, of course, are part of the larger body of Jewish religious literature. And again, in the Greek context, they're associated with the Helios cult. In India, the fables are actually part of the Vaishnava tradition. And again, in Buddhism, they're associated with the worship of Lokeshvara. Exoteric religion and the lay masses versus the esoteric religion and monotheistic understanding in the East and West is at the core of all of these problems regarding which worship, which group, actually had contact with the other. Many of the people of the Western world, like the people of the East, had little or no understanding at all of the doctrines, the actual theology of the religion that they were nominally part of. They may have practiced every different conceivable type of social and religious behavior and still have been geographically identified with a particular religion. What we need to compare is the material available on the actual initiated orders in the West, the so-called mystery cults, and in the East, the bona fide sampradayas or disciplic successions. For instance, the most important one in the research that I've done for associations between East and West and North and South of Asia is the Brahmasurya Sampradaya of Vaishnavism. This living tradition is a veritable ark in which the ancient monotheism of man has been preserved. If one compares the doctrines and practices, the imagery, and so forth of the Brahmasurya Sampradaya of Vaishnavism to Judaism, Christianity, the Helios or so-called Horus cult in the West, and to the doctrines and practices and so forth of the Amita and Amitayus cult in Buddhism, or the worship of Lokeshvara, it becomes very clear that these groups are intimately related and continue to have contact over a period of thousands of years. Their relationship is obviously one of mutual edification and revival. The evidence of the worship of this one God goes so far back in time as to make any argument over who had it first moot.
Well, this is the summary only. And
A remarkably detailed picture of the one ancient monotheism emerges from the wealth of interdisciplinary material which is readily accessible. The careful scholarship of others and new communications technology has made it possible for us to piece together records of lost times and peoples and to compare those records with the experience of people today in various cultures around the world. Sorting the historical data for basic concepts and practices related to this one salvific monotheism produces a vast amount of evidence which supports Campbell's view of a single syndrome of symbolic forms and Aryan and Semitic interaction in the building of biblical myth. In summation, to address the evidence to the specific questions and issues in the introduction, let us review. Judah. Were Buddhist missionaries in the West? What about Vaishnava missionaries? And if so, what kind of Buddhist and Vaishnava missionaries were in the Mediterranean region? From the evidence, it's clear that Buddhist missionaries were in the West, and they were, instead of bringing a new religion, having a revivalist influence, bringing their own brand of Vishnu worship under the name of Lokeshvara. That the worship of Lokeshvara predates Buddhism in Tibet and Northern Buddhism, that it was formative, is clear from a study of the Bon or Tibetan religion, which worships the different forms of Vishnu or Lokeshvara and predates Buddhism. The Vaishnavism that has been missionary in nature forever and was probably in the Mediterranean region at the same time as the Buddhists were, would have equally a revivalist type of influence. Again, because the worship of Vishnu in so many different avatar forms was prevalent and indigenous in the West since prehistory, the influence of these Buddhist and Vaishnava missionaries would have been revivalist in nature. And the specific kind of Vaishnavism, like the worship of Lokeshvara, is related to the Brahmasurya Sampradaya. Regarding Ichimura on Kanza, Buddhist and Christian common sources in a Mediterranean mystery cult, for instance, their intuition is quite correct. That mystery cult would have been the Koros Kore, or Radha Krishna and Balaram cult of the Helios Asyla Federation. On the use of the mystical number 7 in both Buddhist and Christian sources related to the Judeo-Roman rather than Indian tradition, the answer here is that the Lord of Vaishnavism and Mahayana Buddhism is Sapta Mahabhagavata. This title of Vishnu refers to, in fact, his Vahana, or expansion, Anantasheshanaga, who holds the 7 planets on his heads. He is the God of gods and Lord Sabaoth by virtue of being the Lord of the 7-day week, or the Lord of all the 7 planets. The 7 is sacred to Vishnu, it's sacred to Lokeshvara, and it's sacred to Helios. As a matter of fact, there's a name of Helios, Hebdomogenes, which means born or appearing every 7th day, and refers to the fact that all 7s were sacred to his cultus. The last day of his sacred 7-day week commemorated his rest, and the first his rising again. The Jews, the Greeks, and the Vaishnavas have a solar-lunar calendar. Other ancient peoples had solar and lunar calendars. Other ancient peoples also had different time periods that were used other than a 7-day week. But again, the Mahayana Buddhists, the Vaishnavas, and the Jews all shared the same time schedules, including the larger sense of the age. There's close similarity between the age of the present world cycle, according to Mahayana Buddhism, that of Vaishnavism, and that of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Lord as Sapta Mahabhagavata was the patron deity of the people of Israel. This is why people in the Mediterranean region said that Saturn was the protector of Israel. Saturn, again, was identified with Kronos because, in fact, although Saturn wasn't the same as the name Kronos, it was a by-name of the same deity in his wrathful form as Zervan, or time, related to the Vaishnava form of Narahari. In fact, the title of the Egyptian Book of the Dead has been mistranslated as coming forth by day. The glyph for day is Heru, which is also the name of the deity. Clearly, the indication is that the book is about the ascension of the soul to Hari, or God. Sir Alan Gardner asked about a relationship between the Assyrian myth and Mesopotamian influences. He also was looking at the issue of the conquering of Upper Egypt by Lower Egypt. The answer again here is that Egyptian civilization rose with the teaching of the Purusha doctrine. The Purusha doctrine is the source of the Varnashram system in India and a very highly developed concept of the social body, organismic sets, and hierarchical systems. This social organization is responsible for the great civilizations of the ancient world. There was clearly a relationship between the Purusha-worshipping cultuses of the Near and Middle East and the rise of the great civilization in Egypt. Although the worship of Purusha was clearly related to the rise of the first dynasty and great civilization in Egypt, there is abundant prehistoric evidence for the cult of Hari in Egypt before the first dynasty. The explanation for this is probably found in Egyptian lore itself, which claims that Imhotep came to Egypt and brought them the proper way to worship the gods they were already worshiping. He gave them writing, medical art, and timekeeping skills. He's considered not to have brought a new religion at all, but to have uplifted the people who were living in a very degraded state, worshiping the same Lord. In fact, in northern Egypt, a worship developed that dominated the western region for thousands of years. This was, of course, the Asyla Federation of temples. That the Hebrews and Israelites were part of this religious fellowship is clear due to biblical and extra-biblical sources. For instance, Joseph, the patriarch, married the daughter of the high priest of Heliopolis. He was not excommunicated, but is remembered as one of the greatest believers of the Old Testament. And again, we know from other sources that of the 3 different peoples living on the island of Rhodes, which were called dearly beloved of God, one of the colonies was Jewish. In relationship to Robert Graves' questions on the origin of Heracles worship, the original Heracles and his brother were probably the mythic divine duo kings of the Purusha tradition, or Vasudeva and Sankarshan. They were no doubt worshipped as the sacred kings, one warrior and one priest, of the Helios cult, and as such were the Mephistos Kros, or Helios Apollon and Dionysus, i.e. Krishna and Balaram. In northern Egypt, they were worshipped as Ushur or Purusha, and SKR, usually transliterated Soker, but clearly Shukra, Baal. Shukra is a name of Balaram. It means white. Further, the cultus of Balaram, or Shukra, was associated with Som or Chans, or Khonshu, the healer of the Egyptian tradition. The mythic age of the original Heracles worship to ancient Greek writers indicates the prehistoric nature of the Korai, Helios Dionysus, or Krishna Balaram cult. The many stories of Heracles support antiquity of the cult and wide distribution. In fact, ancient mention of 40-some heroes named Heracles supports the idea, again, that the original cultus was very ancient, and by the time of the Greek hero we're familiar with, there had been very many other heroes previously identified with the worship of Vasudeva and Sankarshan. The Egyptians themselves did not claim the origination of the Heracles worship. They say it came from Phoenicia. And in fact, at the time, the Phoenicians said they got it from the Red Sea, and the Red Sea, known to the ancients, was the Indian Ocean. Jane Harrison says that the worship of Heracles was that of the sacred king form of Helios Koros. So again we have the connection of Krishna as Gopal with the sacred king or Vasudeva and his brother. The Spartoi and Argives worshipped Trioculus Helios, and they had a dual kingship. They considered themselves descendants of the original Heracles. These Spartoi, we must remember, are related to the family dynasty of Krishna, and the story of their being destroyed by Cadmus is the story of Parshuram. The Spartoi and others related to them were called erecteds or unguipeds, snake-footed people, precisely because they used the term angua, which is related to the Sanskrit root, the same root which gives us the word naga. The ng or ang is also the source of our words angle and ankle. These were the people who used the Sanskrit root for the word foot. And so the pictorial pun, snake-footed people, because the root was a pun on snake, meaning bent or curved, thus angle. These anguipeds or erecteds came from the city of Warka, according to Western tradition. This same Warka was the area in which the worship of Yah was so prevalent. The Spartans, Argives, and other Dorian peoples considered themselves descended from the Vasudevas or Basodeos, i.e. Krishna and Balaram, who were worshipped very early in Sur or Tyre. Later, Greeks in India recognized their deity Heracles, the incarnation king or Basudeo, was worshipped by the Surasenas there. Bactrian coins minted by the Kushana kings have Vasudeva on one side, translated as Basudeo on the other. Questions from Gilbert Murray. The Greek initiation ceremonies and rites were not remnants of human sacrifice. In the East and West, there were two basic traditions of interpretation and experience of the reality that the ancient doctrines modeled. One was a dualism or qualified non-dualism, in which a benevolent spiritual deity sacrificed himself out of love for the spiritual and physical benefit of beings. The loving and lovable Supreme Being was both beyond and within all finite things. This view promoted ahimsa, asceticism, altruism, and civilizing, socializing behavior and a positive, progressive, and service-oriented worldview. Religious ritual associated with this view was so-called right-hand tantric, i.e., ascetic, aesthetic, etc. The sacrificed Purusha was a cosmic deity. He was spiritual. His rites were so-called symbolic. The other view was a material monism or impersonalism, both of which dispensed with the personal absolute, finite or infinite, and any spiritual concept of love, beauty, etc. Immediate sense gratification and ultimate annihilation were the only realities. This worldview was antisocial, hedonistic, and generally predatory. Ritual associated with this view was so-called left-hand tantric, involving the grossest of material acts such as human sacrifice and raw flesh cannibalism. To left-handers, Purusha was a man to be killed and eaten. This is reflected in the reality of the regicidal cults that did exist in the ancient world. The association of these ritual regicidic cults with so-called goddess worship is well established. Again, we see the relationship to the Kali cults of India and the left-hand tantric practices that involve human sacrifice there. The rise of the so-called Dionysic religion and its phenomenal growth in the West were due to probably a series of so-called left-hand tantric masters impersonating Balaram, or the original Deva Nasya, god of initiation or original spiritual master in the West. Just as the bona fide Hari or Helios cult considered Shukrabal or Balaram to be the original spiritual master and initiator, so the corrupted left-hand tantric cults there had their pseudo-Dionysuses who went around engaging in orgiastic practices in a state of intoxication with the so-called gopis or maenads. This perversion of the Samkarshan or Balaram cult was so prevalent in the centuries before Christ that its memory practically eclipsed that of the original right-hand tantric group. Publicly, the original group was unseen. The esotericism involved with it was specifically designed to prevent the kind of thing that happened with the so-called Dionysic religion. Unfortunately, it appears that disgruntled devotees may have at some point apostated over a number of years and gone away from the original right-hand tantrika teachings into the left-hand tantrika and started these Dionysic orgiastic groups. A new analysis of Greek religion should focus on two areas: the integrated Greco-Roman, Egyptian, Judeo-Christian, etc. doctrines of the Koros, Basudeo, Hari cults and their relationship to the Eastern religions of Vaishnavism and Mahayana Buddhism. And secondly, the sorting out of left-hand from right-hand tantric doctrines and practices in source materials. This will facilitate a greater understanding of religious and political alliances and enmities in the ancient world. In regard to Pejol's questions, no clear differentiation of Eastern and Western religions 2,000 years ago, she stated. Obviously, there was a total interaction. So she's quite right about that. And the Nag Hammadi texts, Dead Sea Scrolls, etc., that I have read in translation have an enormous amount of information in them to indicate a very close interaction between the Mahayana Buddhists, Vaishnavas, and the various Gnostic as well as more orthodox groups in the West. Western tradition didn't have to receive any material from the Eastern sources, as she suggests, because the same ideas and stories were indigenous in the West even before the historic period. On Campbell regarding the unexplored area in 1964. I've explored this area since the early 60s, and the evidence that I've found, as you've seen, much supports Campbell's position. As far as the interplay of Semitic and Aryan factors is concerned, the fact that the existing references to the Hapiru, the Sagas, the Subartu, Hurrians, and others in epigraphical and other sources shows such extraordinary amount of intermarriage and other interaction clearly shows that Campbell was right about this, and that it is, in fact, one of the most important single things that we can continue to study to unfold the mysteries of our ancient history. We have to completely rethink our worldview of ancient history. Too much of it has been predicated upon racist and Eurocentric myths. We have based our view of the world on a projection of very late ideas which in fact have no validity applied to the reality of the world at, say, 1000 BC. Parallels with Chinese myth having their origin in this same one, monotheism, are clear. In fact, prior to Buddhism's existence at all, it's clear that the Lokeshvara cult or the Za cult and so many other different branches of Vaishnavism existed in the Orient. Evidence of this cult is so prevalent in each area at such a remote time that the question of who had it first, of origin and diffusion, becomes meaningless. In every instance, it appears that interaction from east to west was that of revivalist nature, and that in fact nothing really very new was ever introduced. It seems to be a package deal. Wherever the worship of Hari is, there is the worship of the Koros and of the Vasudeva, of all the different avatars. In fact, the Varnashrama system, the doctrines regarding manumission or free will, everything is there manifest at the same time. And where that religion is present, civilization grows. In answer to questions of Goddard, Robin, and Pope, the Old Testament scholars, although Solomon's fleet probably traded with India and apes and peacocks were imported because of their religious significance, totem animals to the Rama and Krishna cults, the mystery cult of the Song of Songs was no doubt the local indigenous Rhoda-Koros cult. Sea trade with India is probably the reason Herodotus later notes that the Ethiopians are so widespread, and why South India, as well as northern India, Vaishnava practices can be seen among the Ethiopians and are described in so many ancient sources. Ancient historians have noted that the Ethiopians dressed the same way, spoke the same way, and used the same weapons as the Indian mercenaries in Mediterranean armies. We must study Vaishnava traditions in order to illuminate what remains of the ancient Western traditions which were so nearly destroyed by wars and sectarian hostilities, for instance during the Hyksos period and the Assyrian domination. Scholars Franz Kumo and Richard Zahner have raised important questions regarding the origin and diffusion of Zoroastrianism and Mithraism. Kumo has stated that we have been unable to determine either the time or the country in which Mithraism took form. Zahner, considered by many to be one of the greatest scholars on Zoroastrianism, has stated frankly that the doctrine of Ahura Mazda was actually borrowed directly from Purusha Sukta. Purusha Sukta is the Vedic hymn used by Vaishnavas and associated by them with the transubstantiation of the offered bhoga, or vegetarian foodstuff, to Vishnu. This host becoming then an incarnation of Vishnu himself. The doctrine of Purusha, of course, is that he sacrificed himself for the creation of the world, and has thus become, amongst other things, the food of all beings. When a Vaishnava takes prasadam, he understands it to be a real presence of God in exactly the same sense as that of the Catholic Christian who receives communion. The Mithraics also had their sacred meals, as did Gnostic and many other orders in Mediterranean at the time of Christ. All of these are derivations of Purusha worship. Mahayana Buddhists also have their prasada. The mystery of the Ahura cult, as opposed to the Vedic Deva cult, is resolved with the understanding that in fact Ahura was Ashura, meaning spiritual, actually from the root ush or vas or as, meaning to exist, to be, or to dwell. The supreme Asura was Vishnu, the supreme spirit. And in fact, as Zahner says, the Ahura cult was the cultus of Purusha. As in the earlier case of the Hebrews reviving the ancient Vedic sacrifices in the face of the corruption of the Pancharatran system, the Zoroastrian religion rose as a reaction to corruption in that area of the world. The Zoroastrians sought to go back to the ancient Vedic fire sacrifice system and make their offerings to Agni as the tongue of Vishnu. The term Ahura or Asura was confounded with the term Asura, meaning those that were against Sura, which is a dialectical form of Hari. The Sura Senoi worshipped Hari or Krishna. So an Asura was someone who was against Hari or Krishna. Asuras were repeatedly confounded historically with the Ashuras, the early class of gods who were expansions of or incarnations of the original Ashura or Usur, in other words, Osiris, the Purusha. In fact, there is evidence that a people called the Usiras lived in the area of Vrindavan, Mathura in very, very remote times. As far as the mystery of Zervanism and its relationship to Zoroastrianism is concerned, it's obvious that the worship of Zervan wasn't some kind of a heterodoxy in Zoroastrianism, but that it was simply the worship of the form of Purusha as Narahari. Again, we see in Zoroastrianism the worship of the Harena or Hare, the glory of God, or Shekinah, some people say. And we see again the idea of the sacred or the anointed king, and many other parallels with Judaism. The mystery of Cyrus the Great and what his true religious allegiance was is resolved in the understanding that the Purusha cult was the dominant religion of that part of the world. When Cyrus went into Babylon and conquered that city with the help of the Jews that were in exile there and the priests of Marduk, when he was hailed as God's anointed king in the Old Testament and received as a liberator by Egyptians living in the colonies, so to speak, the fact was that he wasn't winning Paris by a mass, as scholars have suggested. Although he was a Median Persian, and many say that he wasn't a Zoroastrian, but in fact was a pre-Zoroastrian Vedic believer, the reality was that he worshipped Purusha and that he was obviously a very learned man and understood that his deity was in fact the God of the Jews and the Babylonians and all the other people that had been oppressed by the Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians. He saw his divine duty as that of a liberator of his people. Like Moses, he purposed to set the people of God free. And when he achieved his goal, he took the wealth that he had plundered from the conquerors of the people of God, gave it back to the Jews and others, repatriated them to their homelands, sponsored the rebuilding of their temples, and fostered the reclamation of their intellectual and artistic heritages. The proof of this is that, in fact, when we look at the image of Cyrus's Fravarshi, which has been preserved on the entryway to his throne room at the Palace of Parsegard, we see that the Fravarshi is in fact wearing the Usur crown, the actual God of gods symbol of Purusha in Egypt. This crown, as you have seen, is also there in images of Vishnu. The doctrine related to the different manifestations of God in Egypt, which are symbolized in the Purusha crown, is there in Vaishnavism and in Mahayana Buddhism. Regarding the questions raised by Joseph Campbell in reference to Meek's work, the Hebrews and the Hurrians are found together in Mesopotamia, as mentioned earlier. But their relationship in the Bible is quite specifically spelled out. In fact, Abraham lived in Haran. His family center was in Haran, and he always sent his sons back to Haran to get wives. Haran was one of the major cities of the kingdom of Hari. The relationship between the Hurrians and the Hebrews are clear from a number of things. For instance, in Joshua chapter 9, when the Hebrews and Israelites are on their genocidal rampage in Canaan to take the land promised to them by God, they are instructed by the Lord to wipe out all of the Hyksos-related left-hand Tantrika groups that are living there at the time. By a contrivance, the Hivites, by many people considered to be Hurrians, as were the Gibeonite Tetrapolis people, the Hivites contrive a plan to go to the Israelites and make a pact with them in the name of their mutual God. By this contrivance, the Hivites spared their lives and became the servants of the God of the Jews in their temples forever. Joseph Campbell's conclusion that there was a single world religion in prehistory which diffused prior to the rise of the great Bronze Age Sumero-Egyptian kingly states is clearly correct. Continuous interaction between so-called Aryan and Semitic factors, as well as East and West, is also clear. Earlier or less modified forms of the ancient faith may be found today among more isolated peoples, for instance the Tibetans, and in areas where the system remained more dominant longer, for instance in India. In the West, perhaps among some extremely strict initiatory orders, we may get some information regarding the existence of this early monotheism.
This Hebrew form of the holy name shows the characteristic of dropping the initial aspirate. The Egyptian, of course, letters were H, R, and these vowel sounds have been added by speculation. It was probably pronounced Hari or Hari. The Greeks, as did the Hebrews, used the L for the R sound. This is very interesting when you look at the Hebrew letters R and L, which are very similar, and also the Egyptian glyphs for R and L are identical. Here the sibilant and the aspirate are exchanged, and the R and the L are interchanged. Here we have the loss of the initial aspirate, as in the Hebrew. Same thing. This meaning lion in Hebrew. Here it means this is the name of the sun. And over here, the meaning that's given for Ali, the holy name of Allah or Ali, is Most High, which is a kind of an associative meaning. Of course, the secular scholars say that this name of the Hebrew deity is actually, this was a soul or deity. And again, this deity is the Egyptian form of Heliopolis, that worshipped at Heliopolis as Hli, or Hiru, or Hari. And this is like the dialectical variant of Hari, seen in India as Sura, S-R. This is another variation of that. This is the Zoroastrian or Avestan form of Havare, and maybe they clue to what the Subarian people actually were. There's so much interchange between the use of the terms Subarian and Hurrian in ancient sources that scholars have speculated that the actual name Subarian, with the consonantal values of an S, a B, R, and then the end on it, may actually be a dialectical form of the word Hurrian. Now, if we look at this, we see that if the sibilant is substituted for the aspirate here, and the B for V, which was a common exchange, R, and then we look at the longer form of this word, which was Farena. It may in fact have been Subarian, and for the meaning of it, again, this is very important, this word being the name of the deity, and we look at the dialectical form in India of Sura instead of Hari, it's actually astounding how it emerges and is completely intelligible. This, in fact, then becomes Sfar, as in Svarga, the name of the deity, as Suvar, or Sfar, whose abode is Svarga, or heaven. And therefore, they're correct in their idea that actually Subar, as in Subarian, is another linguistic variant of Hare, or Hare, as in Hurrian. That accounts for why the Hurrians are also called Subarians by some. Now, this is a Zoroastrian, again, term, Zervin, and it means gold, as does the And this one here, Hware, is the effulgence of the deity, symbolized by the chakra, of course. Now in Tibet, the same deity which was worshipped as Hware in the Zoroastrian is seen as Za in Tibet, and he's associated with Hari, the immanent form of Lokeshvar, which is situated in the heart of all beings. And the transliteration of the Tibetan and the Nepalese Buddhist deity name in the heart is usually H-R-I-H. Now, in the Sanskrit, Hari and Hira both mean gold and yellow, and they're from the this lost root HR. And Sura is another variant which means gold or yellow. And in the Western tradition, of course, the Chi Rho, Greek letters Chi and Rho, are the root of the word chryso, which means gold. Which is another example of the connection here with this meaning of the word, as in also other later words, or, aura, meaning gold, A-U-R-A, and the very earliest forms that we find in in Mesopotamia, in the Near East, are actually, and I don't have them on the chart here, transliterated as A-A-R-H-I, R-E, and Z-A-A-L-I, Zalhi, and both are given the translation of gold. So the evidence seems to be quite compelling that the actual original meaning of this particular holy name was associated with the golden light of the sun, or the feature, the gold form of the Lord. And of course it's related to the Shalagam Gayatri, where one is enjoined to meditate always on the resplendent golden form of Lord Hari seated within the heart of the sun. Now here again is the Greek Hali, which is found used that way for Hari in some Indian sources, and the Greeks during some of their time in India wrote the name of the deity Hari with a Chi and a Rho, just as the early so-called Christian symbol was used, Chi and Rho. And this is the way that scholars usually transliterate the deity name of the kingdom of Mitanni or Hari, and they had some argument about whether it was originally supposed to be pronounced Hari, and whether the worshippers of this people were actually the Aryans. But they ultimately dismissed the idea that these were the Aryans because they said it was not an Indo-European language. Of course, according to the evidence that I present in this thesis, Aryan was a religious epitaph and didn't necessarily indicate a person who spoke a so-called Indo-Aryan language. Now, to the word Savior, we see the root here, so in the Greek, Shua in the Hebrew, Shu in the North Egyptian deity name of Shu, Savior God, and in South Egypt, Khonshu, the Savior God. And these are all by-names, incidentally, of Agnitas or Asclepius or Serapis, the Savior deity of the ancient world, especially worshipped as the great physician and the Redeemer. And the importance of the doctrine of redemption can be seen in the Sanskrit root, the usages of the different words that are derivative from the Sanskrit root, and they have the various meanings of to buy back, to redeem, to cleanse or purify ritually by a payment. And In fact, if one goes through the Sanskrit, the various meanings given to the